I still remember the smell of smoke filling my lungs that morning. And I need to tell you something right now. Something I've carried in my heart for 43 years. My hands are shaking as I speak these words because what happened that night in 1982 changed everything I thought I knew about faith, about loss, about miracles hiding in the darkest moments of our lives. They say you never forget the sound of fire eating through your home, and they're right. Every single detail is burned into my memory like a scar that never fades. I was 79 years old when it happened, living alone in that old house on Maple Street in our quiet Michigan town, the same house where I raised my 3 children, the same house where my beloved Henry took his last breath 5 years earlier. That March morning started like any other. I woke up at 5:30, made my coffee, sat in my favorite chair by the window, and said my prayers like I had done every single day for 60 years. But by 6:15, my entire world was about to collapse, and I didn't even know it yet. The fire started 3 houses down from mine, in the Pattersons' garage. Old electrical wiring, they said later. Within minutes, the wind carried those hungry flames from house to house, and our neighborhood, our safe little corner of the world, became an inferno. I can still hear Mrs. Chen screaming, still see Mr. Rodriguez running with his granddaughter in his arms, still feel the terror that gripped every single one of us that morning. My neighbor, young Tommy Bradford, he was the one who pounded on my door. Mrs. Williams, you have to get out now. His voice was pure panic, and when I opened that door, I saw orange and red dancing in the morning sky, coming closer, always closer. Now, I want to ask you something. Wherever you're watching this from, whatever state, whatever country, have you ever had to choose what matters most in 30 seconds? Have you ever had to look around your home and decide what defines your entire life? Please, write in the comments where you're watching from, because I need to know my story is reaching people who understand what it means to hold on and to let go. I stood there in my nightgown, frozen, as Tommy pulled at my arm. "We have to go now," he shouted, but my feet wouldn't move. See? That house wasn't just wood and nails and old paint peeling in the corners. Every room held a memory I couldn't bear to lose. The kitchen where Henry proposed to me in 1943, right before he shipped out to the Pacific. The bedroom where I gave birth to my youngest, Rebecca, during that terrible snowstorm when we couldn't get to the hospital. The living room where we celebrated 50 Christmases, where my grandchildren took their first steps, where we laughed and cried and built a life together. But what caught my eye, what stopped my heart in that moment of chaos, was sitting in the corner of that living room, my statue of Mary, the Blessed Mother. She wasn't fancy, nothing special to anyone else, just 14 inches tall, made of plaster, with chipped paint on her blue robe and a crack running down her right side from when my son David knocked her over playing baseball in the house in 1958. Had prayed in front of that statue every single morning for 47 years. When Henry was overseas fighting in World War II, I prayed. When my daughter Sarah was diagnosed with polio in 1952, I prayed. When we almost lost the house during the recession in the 70s, I prayed. That statue had witnessed every fear, every hope, every desperate plea I'd ever whispered into the darkness. "Mrs. Williams, please." Tommy was crying now, actually crying. This strong young man who worked construction, reduced to tears because I wouldn't move. The smoke was getting thicker, burning my throat, making my eyes water. I could hear the fire now, really hear it. That terrible crackling sound, like the world being consumed bite by bite. Through my front window, I watched the Hendersons' house, 2 doors down, collapse in on itself, sending sparks flying into the sky like demonic fireflies. I pulled away from Tommy and stumbled, toward the living room. "Just one thing," I gasped. "Just let me get one thing." The heat was unbearable. Even though the flames hadn't reached my house yet, I could feel them coming, feel them reaching for everything I loved. I made it to that corner, my knees protesting every step, my lungs screaming for clean air, and I fell down right there in front of that statue. Both my hands were on her, ready to grab her and run, when something inside me broke. I looked at that chipped, cracked, dusty old statue, and I started sobbing, really sobbing, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere so deep you didn't even know it existed, because I realized in that moment that if I had to choose between that statue and my life, between holding on to the past and having any future at all, I didn't know what to do. I pressed my forehead against her cool plaster surface, and I prayed one more time. "God," I whispered, my voice raw and broken, "if you're taking my home, if you're taking every memory I've built here, please, I'm begging you, protect my heart. But if there's any hope, any chance, any mercy left in this world, please, let her stay. Let this one thing survive. Let me have this one piece of everything I'm about to lose." Tommy grabbed me then, physically lifted me up and dragged me toward the door. I was screaming, fighting him, trying to get back to that statue. But he was stronger, and the smoke was so thick I couldn't see anymore. We made it outside just as my front windows exploded from the heat, glass raining down onto the porch where I'd sat every summer evening for 36 years. The neighbors had gathered in the street, all of us in our night, watching our lives burn. Mrs. Chen was on her knees, rocking back and forth. The Patterson family stood together, the father with his head in his hands, the mother holding their 2 children close. We were a congregation of loss, united in devastation, watching everything we'd worked for turn to ash and smoke. The firefighters did what they could, but in a small town like ours, with old houses built too close together and volunteer crews who were mostly farmers and shop owners, there was only so much they could do. By the time they got the blaze under control, 5 houses were gone completely. 5 homes, 5 families, entire histories, erased in less than 2 hours. My house, my beautiful old house with the crooked porch and the creaky stairs and the window that never quite closed right, was a shell. The roof had caved in. The second floor where my children's bedrooms had been was just gone. The kitchen where I'd cooked 10,000 meals was blackened and destroyed. Everything was ruined. I sat on the curb across the street, wrapped in a blanket someone had given me, and I couldn't even cry anymore. I was empty, completely empty, like the fire had burned away not just my home but some essential part of who I was. People came and went, saying things I didn't really hear, offering comfort I couldn't really feel. Hours passed. The sun rose higher in that March sky, indifferent to our suffering, shining down on the smoldering remains of everything we'd known. I watched the firefighters move through the ruins, their heavy boots crunching on broken glass and charred wood, and I thought about all the mornings I'd watched the sunrise from my kitchen window while Henry read the newspaper at the table. I thought about the Christmas of 1964, when David broke his arm falling off his new bicycle in the living room, how we'd rushed him to the hospital in a panic, how he'd been more worried about getting in trouble than about the pain. That living room was gone now. I thought about Sarah's high school graduation party in 1968, how we'd crammed 40 people into that little house, how the neighbors had complained about the music but then showed up with potato salad and stayed until midnight. That dining room where we'd celebrated was gone too. I thought about the afternoon in 1977 when Henry had his first heart attack, right there in our bedroom. How I'd called the ambulance and held his hand and prayed to that statue downstairs while we waited. how he'd survived that day, but we both knew our time was borrowed from then on. That bedroom was ash now. Every memory was tied to those rooms, those walls, those floors, and sitting there on that curb, watching the smoke still rising from what used to be my life, I felt like I was losing Henry all over again, losing my children's childhoods all over again, losing every piece of who I'd been for 79 years. Mrs. Patterson came and sat beside me around 10 in the morning. Her face was streaked with tears and soot, and she didn't say anything at first, just sat there holding my hand. Her house had started it all. Her family's faulty wiring had spread this destruction to all of us, and I could see the guilt eating her alive. "Martha," she finally whispered, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." I turned to look at her. This woman who'd been my neighbor for 12 years, who'd brought me casseroles after Henry died, who'd shoveled my driveway every winter without me ever asking. And I saw in her eyes the same devastation I felt in my own heart. "It's not your fault, Patricia," I told her, squeezing her hand. "These old houses, these old wires, it could have been any of us. It could have started in my basement just as easily." She collapsed against me then, sobbing, and I held her while she cried. This woman who'd lost everything just like I had, who was carrying guilt on top of grief, and somehow, in that moment of comforting her, I felt a tiny spark of something other than emptiness. Purpose, maybe, connection, the reminder that, even in loss, we still have each other. It was almost noon when the fire chief, Bob Mitchell, who had been in my Sunday school class 30 years ago, came over to me. His face was covered in soot, his eyes red from smoke, and he looked about 100 years old. "Martha," he said quietly, kneeling down beside me, "we're going to go through what's left, see if we can salvage anything. But I have to be honest with you, there's not much hope. The heat, it destroys almost everything, even things that don't burn." I just nodded. What else could I do? "But," he continued, and something in his voice made me look up at him, "there's something you need to see, something that doesn't make any sense at all." He helped me up, and we walked across the street. The smell of burned wood and melted plastic was overwhelming, making me gag. We had to be careful where we stepped because the structure wasn't stable. Everything was wet and charred and broken. Bob led me to where my living room had been. The furniture was gone, just twisted metal frames and springs. The walls were black. The beautiful hardwood floors Henry had refinished himself in 1960 were destroyed. My photographs, my books, my grandmother's quilt, all of it, ashes. But there, in that corner, in the exact spot where I'd left her, where I'd prayed my desperate prayer, stood my statue of Mary. She was covered in soot and ash, her white face now gray, but she was standing upright, untouched by the flames that had consumed everything around her. The small table she'd been sitting on was completely burned away, yet somehow she stood there on what remained of the floor, as if someone had carefully placed her there while the world burned. I couldn't speak. I literally couldn't make a sound. I walked toward her, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand, and I picked her up. She was still cool to the touch, despite the heat all around us. The crack in her side was still there, the chipped paint on her robe unchanged. Everything about her exactly as it had been when I'd pressed my forehead against her just hours before. "Martha," Bob said, his voice full of wonder and confusion, "I've been fighting fires for 32 years. I've seen some strange things, things I can't always explain, but this is impossible." The heat in this room was over 800 degrees. Everything within 10 feet of where that statue stood was completely destroyed. Everything. There's no scientific reason, no logical explanation for why that plaster statue didn't crack, didn't melt, didn't even fall over when the floor around it collapsed. I held her against my chest and finally, I started crying again. But these were different tears. Not tears of loss, but tears of something I didn't even have a name for. Relief, gratitude, all of it mixed together in a moment so powerful. I thought my old heart might actually stop beating. Bob called the other firefighters over, and they stood around me in a circle. These big, strong men who'd seen everything, and they were all staring at that statue like it was speaking to them in a language only the heart could understand. One of them, young Mike Peterson, took off his helmet and crossed himself. Another, Dale Richardson, who I'd known since he was born, just shook his head and whispered, "I'll be damned." Word spread fast. By that evening, people I'd never even met were coming by to see the statue, to hear what happened, to touch her, and marvel at what they were calling a miracle. The local newspaper ran a story the next day with the headline, "Divine Protection, Statue Survives. Impossible Odds." The regional news channel came out to interview me that weekend, but sitting there in the ruins that afternoon, holding that statue while firefighters and neighbors gathered around me, I wasn't thinking about miracles or newspapers or explanations. I was thinking about my mother. She'd given me that statue in 1935. When I was just 12 years old, we were living through the Depression, and my father had lost his job at the factory. We had nothing, absolutely nothing. Some days we ate watery soup for all 3 meals. Some nights I went to bed with my stomach cramping from hunger. But my mother never lost her faith. Every morning, she'd kneel in front of this very statue, which her mother had given her, and she'd pray. She'd pray for food, for work, for strength, for hope. And somehow, we survived. Somehow, we made it through those terrible years. When I turned 12, in the middle of the worst year we'd had, my mother wrapped that statue in newspaper and gave it to me. "Martha," she said, taking my young hands in hers, "I want you to have this, not because it's valuable, because it's not. Not because it's beautiful, though I think it is, but because I want you to remember that faith isn't about having all the answers. Faith is about holding on when you don't understand, when everything seems lost, when the world tells you there's no hope left." I'd carried those words with me for 67 years, through my own hard times, through the war years when Henry was gone and I didn't know if he'd come home, through illnesses and disappointments and the normal sorrows that come with living a long life. And now, standing in the ashes of everything I'd built, I was holding that same statue, and my mother's words echoed in my mind like a benediction. The days after the fire were some of the hardest I'd ever lived through. My children came immediately. Of course, David drove up from Ohio, Sarah flew in from California, and Rebecca, who lived just 2 towns over, had been there within an hour of hearing the news. They wanted me to come stay with them, to leave Michigan, to start over somewhere else. But I couldn't. This was my home, this town, this street, this little plot of land where Henry and I had built our life together. I couldn't just walk away from it. Even if there was nothing left but a concrete foundation and memories made of smoked out, we stayed at the church for the first week. Pastor Williams, no relation despite the same last name, opened up the fellowship hall, and 5 families from the fire moved in there temporarily. We slept on cots, ate donated food, wore donated clothes. I'd never felt more vulnerable in my life, more exposed, more dependent on the kindness of others. But something beautiful happened in that fellowship hall. Every evening, we'd gather together, all of us who'd lost our homes, and we'd talk, really talk, about what we'd lost, yes, but also about what remained, about gratitude for surviving, about the community that had surrounded us, about the unexpected gifts hidden in the tragedy that Mrs. Chen talked about. how she'd been holding on to her deceased husband's clothes for 15 years, unable to let them go, and how the fire had forced her to release that grief. Mr. Patterson talked about how the fire had made him realize he'd been working too much, missing his children's lives, and how he was going to change that. Young couple in their 30s, the Martins, talked about how they'd been fighting constantly before the fire, but nearly losing each other had reminded them why they fell in love in the first place. And I talked about my statue. I brought her to the fellowship hall every evening, and people would come and look at her, touch her, ask me to tell the story again and again. Some people believed it was a miracle, divine intervention. Others thought there must be some scientific explanation we just hadn't figured out yet. But everyone agreed it was remarkable, something worth talking about, something that gave them hope in a hopeless situation. 3 weeks after the fire, on a Sunday morning, I carried that statue to church service. Our little congregation of about 60 people had swelled to over 100, with folks coming from neighboring towns to hear about what happened. To see the statue that survived, Bofter Williams asked me to speak that morning, to share my testimony. I'd never spoken in front of that many people before, and my hands were shaking as I stood at the pulpit, holding the statue against my chest like a shield. I don't know if what happened was a miracle, I started, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm not a theologian, I'm not special. I'm just an old woman who lost her home and found something in the ashes that shouldn't have survived. I looked out at all those faces, some I'd known my whole life, some I was seeing for the first time, and I saw my own pain reflected back at me, because every single person in that room had lost something. Maybe not a house, maybe not in a fire, but loss is loss. We all carry it. What I do know, I continued, my voice getting stronger, is that in my darkest moment, I prayed for one thing, not for my house to be saved, not for all my possessions to survive, but for my heart to be protected, for one sign that hope still existed. And this statue standing here, when everything else fell, that's my sign, that's my hope, and I'm sharing her with all of you. Because maybe you need a sign too. Maybe you need to know that something can survive even when everything else is burning. By the time I finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in that church. People came up afterward, one after another, to hug me, to touch the statue, to whisper their own stories of loss and survival. An elderly man told me about losing his wife to cancer the year before. A young mother told me about her son's battle with addiction. A middle-aged woman told me about her recent divorce. Everyone carrying their own fire, their own destruction, their own need for a sign. The rebuilding process took 2 years. The insurance money came through, eventually, though it was never enough. My children helped financially, blessed them, though it strained their own families' budgets. The church took up a collection. Strangers who'd heard the story sent donations. Slowly, painfully, a new house rose from the ashes of the old one. It was smaller, simpler, just one story now, easier for my aging body to navigate. The rooms were different, the layout unfamiliar. It smelled like new paint and fresh wood instead of decades of life lived. But it was mine. Built on the same ground where Henry and I had started our life together all those years ago. The first thing I did when I moved in was place that statue in the corner of my new living room, in the same spot where she'd stood in the old house. And every morning since then, for 43 years now, I've sat in front of her with my coffee and said my prayers. People still come to see her sometimes. The story has become part of our town's history, passed down like folklore. Young couples getting married ask me to bring the statue to their weddings for good luck. Families facing hard times stop by my house and ask if they can pray in front of her. I always say yes. She's not mine really, not anymore. She belongs to everyone who needs hope. I've watched my grandchildren grow up and have children of their own. I've buried friends, including sweet Mrs. Chen and brave Tommy Bradford, who saved my life that morning. I've celebrated birthdays and holidays in this new house, created new memories to layer over the old ones. Life goes on, as it always does, marked by joy and sorrow in equal measure. But every single day, I look at that statue, and I remember. I remember the heat, and the smoke, and the terror. I remember the loss, and the devastation, and the emptiness. And I remember the moment I picked her up from the ashes, cool to the touch, impossibly intact, and felt something bigger than myself holding me together when I was falling apart. My daughter, Sarah, asked me a few years ago if I ever doubted the meaning of it all, if I ever questioned whether it really was a miracle or just an accident of physics and luck. Does it matter? I asked her, does it change anything whether God reached down and protected that statue, or whether some quirk of how the fire burned left her standing? Either way, in my moment of deepest need, I prayed for one thing, and that one thing survived. Either way, I found hope in the ashes. Either way, I'm still here, still believing, still holding on. She smiled at me then, my beautiful daughter who'd grown into such a wise woman, and said, "No, Mama, I guess it doesn't matter. The hope is the same either way." And that's the truth I've learned in my 86 years on this earth. Hope doesn't require certainty. Faith doesn't demand proof. Sometimes, surviving is the miracle. Sometimes, standing upright when everything around you has fallen is enough. I think about all of you watching this, listening to an old woman ramble about a fire that happened before many of you were born, and I wonder what fires you're facing. What losses are consuming your world right now? What are you desperately praying will survive when the smoke clears? Maybe it's a relationship that's falling apart. Maybe it's a job you're about to lose. Maybe it's a health diagnosis that's stealing your future. Maybe it's the slow burn of depression or addiction or grief that's eating away at everything you thought you knew about yourself. Maybe it's the fear that you've lived your whole life wrong and it's too late to change. Maybe it's the loneliness of feeling like nobody understands, nobody cares, nobody would notice if you disappeared. I see you. I was you. I am you. We're all standing in front of our burning houses, trying to decide what matters most, what's worth saving, what we can't live without. And I'm here to tell you that sometimes you don't get to choose what survives. Sometimes the fire takes everything you were trying to hold on to and leaves standing the one thing you didn't even realize you needed. Sometimes the miracle isn't in preventing the loss. It's in discovering what remains when the loss is complete. That statue standing in my living room right now, she's not just a reminder of what I survived. She's a reminder of what my mother survived during the Depression. She's a reminder of what my grandmother survived as an immigrant coming to this country with nothing but hope and determination. She's a reminder that loss and survival are woven together through generations, that we're all connected by the fires we face and the miracles we find. When Henry died in 1977, I thought my life was over. I'd been married to him for 41 years, and I didn't know how to be Martha without Henry. The grief was suffocating, crushing, absolute. I prayed in front of that statue every day, begging God to either take the pain away or take me with Henry. Neither happened. What did happen was slower, quieter. Day by day, I kept waking up. Day by day, I kept praying. Day by day, the pain changed from something that was killing me into something I could carry, not because it got smaller, but because I got stronger. And that statue stood witness to every single one of those days, silent and steady and somehow reassuring. when Sarah's marriage fell apart in 1989, when she showed up at my door at 2 in the morning with her 3 children and a suitcase, broken and ashamed and convinced her life was ruined, I brought her into the living room. We sat in front of that statue together, and I told her about the fire for the 100th time. I told her that sometimes everything has to burn down before something new can grow. I told her that survival is possible, even when it doesn't feel like it. She lived with me for 8 months while she got back on her feet. Those were hard months, cramped and emotional and full of tears, but they were also beautiful months, watching my daughter remember who she was underneath the identity of wife and mother, watching her become strong again, or maybe become strong in a new way she'd never been before. And every morning, we'd have our coffee in front of that statue, 2 women from different generations facing different fires, but finding the same hope. That when my grandson Tommy, named after young Tommy Bradford, who saved my life, told me he was gay in 2003, he was terrified of judgment, of rejection, of losing his family. He sat in front of that statue with me and cried. This beautiful boy who I'd loved since the moment he was born, convinced that God couldn't love him because of who he was. I held his hands, just like my mother had held mine 80 years earlier, and I said, Tommy, do you see this statue? She survived 800 degrees of heat when everything else burned. There's no scientific reason for it, no logical explanation, and there's no logical explanation for love either, for the way a heart chooses who it chooses. But that doesn't make it less real, less valid, less worthy of being protected. You are my miracle, just as much as this statue is, and anyone who can't see that is blind. He hugged me so tight that day, sobbing against my shoulder. And I thought about all the different kinds of fires we face in life, how some burn through our houses and some burn through our hearts, how some are visible and some are hidden, how all of them hurt and all of them change us and all of them require us to decide what we're going to hold on to when everything else is turning to ash. I'm 86 years old now, and I don't have many years left. My body is wearing out, the way old bodies do. My knees don't work right anymore. My hands shake. My memory isn't what it used to be. Sometimes I forget what I had for breakfast, but I never forget the smell of that smoke, the feel of that statue cool against my forehead, the moment I found her standing in the ashes. When my time comes, and it will come soon, I've left instructions that the statue goes to Sarah. And when Sarah's time comes, it'll go to Tommy. And on through the generations. This simple plaster statue that survived the impossible, passing from hand to hand, carrying with it the story of loss and survival and hope. Because that's what we do, isn't it? We survive, and then we pass on the story of our survival. We face our fires, whatever form they take. And then we tell the people coming after us that it's possible to stand when everything falls, that hope isn't foolish, that faith isn't weakness, that miracles, whether divine or simply the inexplicable grace of random chance, do happen. So, wherever you are right now, whatever you're facing, whatever fire is threatening to consume everything you love, I want you to look around, look carefully, because somewhere in your life, there is something that will survive. Maybe you can't see it yet. Maybe it's hidden in the smoke. Maybe you won't know what it is until the flames die down and you're standing in the ashes, broken and empty and convinced there's nothing left. But it's there. I promise you, it's there. Your statue, your miracle, your sign that hope still exists even in the midst of complete devastation. Look for it, pray for it, believe in it, and when you find it, hold on to it with everything you have. And then, when you're ready, when you've caught your breath and remembered how to stand upright, tell someone else, tell your story of loss and survival, because someone out there needs to hear it. Someone is standing in front of their burning house right now, trying to decide whether to give up or keep going, and your story might be the thing that helps them choose to keep going. That's why I'm telling you mine. Not because I think I'm special, but because I know you need to hear it. Because 43 years ago, I needed to hear it too. And the message came in the form of a statue standing where it shouldn't have been able to stand. My name is Martha Williams. I'm 86 years old. I've survived loss and fire and grief and time itself. And I'm here to tell you that miracles are real. They might not look like you expect. They might be small and chipped and covered in soot, but they're real. They're waiting. And they will stand when everything else falls. That's my promise to you, from one survivor to another. That's my testimony, my truth, my gift. And may you find your own statue, your own light, your own small miracle when you need it most. God bless you all, wherever you are, whatever you're carrying, whatever fire you're walking through. You're not alone. You've never been alone. And there is hope. Always hope, standing quiet and steady in the corner, waiting for you to see it. Thank you for listening to this old woman's story. Thank you for caring enough to hear it through to the end. And please, if this touched your heart in any way, leave a comment below telling me where you're from and what your own miracle has been. We all need to know we're not alone in this. We all need to share our light with each other. May your own miracle find you when you need it most.